Welcome back, welcome back. Hey, let's wrap up Unit 4, Nutrition with Mini Lecture 3, and kind of conclude here how nutrients are going to provide for bodily function. So when we talk about water uptake under different temperature conditions and amount of water that animals should drink, and these are just kind of basic guidelines, beef cattle in that 7 to 20 gallon of water a day, dairy cattle somewhere between 10 and 29, and actually high producing dairy cows are going to be actually between 30 and 50, more specifically. And then of course we get down to chickens and horses and swine, 3 to 5 gallon a day, just to kind of give you some idea about how much water you should drink. Now, most people don't worry too much about how much an animal is drinking. Some of your better designed production systems, especially your hog units, your dairy farms, some of your beef structures will have inline water meters so that you can really get an idea of approximately how much water is disappearing going into those animals for that group. And I think that's a great idea to have a pretty good understanding of how much water you are using and how much water your animals are consuming. When we talk about nutrient requirements here, and we have to start with body maintenance. Your body's first job is to maintain itself. No gain of weight, no loss of weight before we can get to production. So maintenance is a really high priority for nutrients. We have to repair bodily tissue. Epithelial cells have to be replaced all throughout the body. You're constantly needing to generate white blood cells or red blood cells or a number of different things. We have to maintain temperature. We have to maintain vital organ function. And then, of course, we need water balance maintenance. So that homeostasis, that equilibrium that must be maintained, has to happen throughout the body. Maintenance takes about half of all the feed that an animal consumes, or about half of all the food stuff that you and I consume. So, but we can break that down into a few more specifics. For example, feedlot steers don't need a lot for maintenance. Feedlot steers are pretty easy to just maintain body weight and no growth and no fattening, of course. And that takes about 30 to 40% of their maintenance need. Breeding animals, on the other hand, may need about 90% for maintenance, depending on the animal. Milk cows that are making 100 pounds a day might need 4 to 5 times their maintenance requirement in order to support production. Otherwise, they're going to falter. So, and of course, there's a correlation between body size and maintenance. The larger the body, the more there is to be maintained, but it's not at a linear rate. Now, growth only occurs in animals whenever protein synthesis, so the amount of protein made within the body, is greater than protein breakdown. So, as you feed animals the correct amount of feedstuffs, the cellular tissue goes through the process of building proteins. And that's how muscle tissue is added. That's how bones are grown. And that's how you get bigger and stronger. And that can only happen if the rate of that synthesis is greater than the breakdown that would occur. And the cells also have to increase in number and size. We're going to build muscle, we're going to build bone, we're going to build connective tissue, we're going to strengthen all of those things as animals grow appropriately. And so we need energy, we need protein, we need minerals, we need vitamins, and of course we need water to make all those things go together. Muscular growth is typically due to protein feeding. So if you really want structural and muscular growth, feed higher levels of protein. And some of us that are pushing for different reasons may feed even excessively high levels of protein. So let's talk about nutrient requirements for fattening for a second. So we understand a little bit about maintenance. We're going to understand a little bit about growth. Talking about fattening here, now we have to get past that point where we're providing enough energy for growth. The animal's body is designed to store some surplus feed, and especially when we talk about carbohydrate, in and around body tissue. We've looked at, like in Unit 3, we looked at animals and how they marble, and look at the fat flex inside the muscular tissue and outside the muscular tissue. The body's able to store that fat, store that energy for future use as needed. In some regards, of course, we've mentioned that's pretty desirable. And like we mentioned in the first mini lecture, fat is about 2.25 times more energy dense. And will store fat due to excessive feeding of carbohydrates, fats, or proteins. All right, moving on, let's talk about reproductive needs for nutrient requirements. Really simply, it takes very little in most cases to make gametes. So sex cells is what we're referring to. Very little above normal body maintenance need. But body condition does affect fertility. So if we have animals that are excessively low in body condition, they're not going to be as fertile. Same thing actually happens consequently whenever we have animals that are excessively fat. They're also less fertile and have more reproductive problems. Fetal growth then occurs at a really, really high level the last trimester of pregnancy. So as we get animals that are entering that last 3 months, so to speak, the fetus grows at an exponential rate, much, much faster than in prior months. And so at that time, we're not only really supporting mama now, we're also supporting baby. So the health requirements and the nutrient requirements get higher and more important. And also at the same time, that mama is typically eats a little bit less feed. So the nutrient package has to get more dense in order to support her appropriately. Let's then talk about nutrient requirements briefly for lactation. Of course, milk production needs requires a lot of protein, a lot of mineral, a lot of vitamins, and then a lot of energy. Protein is the greatest in terms of requirement. Milk contains about 3% protein, so a lot of that protein that you're feeding your animal is going to dump very directly almost into the milk. Whenever rations are deficient, the body will actually mobilize muscular protein in order to dump it into the milk, because her primary function, once she is lactating, in her mind, she's feeding a baby. So it is her primary function to make milk. And therefore, she will pull body resources as necessary off her back until they're no longer there in order to make milk for baby. Of course, we talk about a few other things. Calcium and phosphorus are also super critical. There's a disease called hypocalcemia that cows can enter into whenever there's not enough calcium circulating in the blood, and they can get very clinically ill and potentially even die from that. It's just an example of a metabolic problem that could go wrong here if we don't have a properly balanced diet. Furthermore, energy is super critical, of course. And milk production will be highly limited by the amount of protein and especially the amount of energy that are in the diet. And production sometimes is limited by intake. We talked about the energy needs of a high-producing dairy cow and say, well, why do some cows lose weight? Well, very simply, on occasion, there's not enough energy density in the diet. So that cow, in order to support that milk production requirement, she will pull and mobilize energy fat reserves off of her back and dump them into milk production for those express purposes. I have a question here at the bottom. What's the ideal forage to concentrate ratio? Well, for most high-producing dairies, you need about a 50-50 ratio, 50% concentrate, 50% forage, in order to achieve an optimum production level on most of today's commercial dairies. Now, of course, if we're going to go to a pasture-based feeding system, you're going to go up into the 75 or 80% or even higher than that pasture, and only maybe 20%, 30% grain. If we talk about steers, some of those rations are going to be as high as 90% grain and only 10% forage. And some of them might be more like 60% grain and 40% forage. It all depends upon your approach to feeding. The main thing is keeping them healthy. How about some basic nutrient requirements for work? And well, here we're primarily discussing the horse, of course. And here specifically energy. Horses need a regular exercise schedule to maintain good health, good muscle tone, good function, and perspiration removes a lot of nitrogenous waste. So we need a proper amount of protein. Horses don't require very high protein feeding levels, but they do require an adequate amount of energy in order for them to work appropriately. And of course, the more often and the more intense the workouts, the more energy they're going to require. If you're just pleasure riding once in a while on a weekend, their energy requirement's not going to be particularly high. If you have a working horse that you're out working regularly day after day, sorting steers and detecting problems out with your cattle ranch. Those horses need a significant amount of energy dense feed stuff and have to be supported quite differently. So a little bit on ration formulation here as we start to come to the end of this final mini lecture. Some things to consider. It's your job formulating a ration to economically match the animal's nutrient requirements with what you have available to feed. You can't be planning on putting feedstuffs in that you couldn't get or they're really, really expensive. You got to find other things, but because of course, feed is going to be most of the time 50% of your cost of production. So you want to make sure and be optimal in the amount of money that you spend and then optimal in your performance. But you've also got to consider things like palatability or how it tastes. Physically, what form does it take? How are you going to feed it? And then, how would you present it to the animals? How easy is it to feed? And we'll talk more about that in much more detail later on. Also have to pause just a little bit and talk about diets in relation to environmental risk. Whenever we overfeed certain things like nitrogen and phosphorus, we take a pretty significant environmental risk. The body doesn't store very much nitrogen at all in terms of when we overfeed protein. It excretes it out as ammonia, and that builds up in manure, of course, and then we have to spread that on fields. That is a surface water pollutant. Phosphorus, when we overfeed phosphorus, the body doesn't store that either. And so whenever your fecal matter levels of phosphorus are high, that all gets hauled to the field, and phosphorus is a groundwater pollutant. So we have to be very cautious about those two and how we feed and distribute those carefully so as not to violate our good stewardship of the environment. Here's just some examples of what a final mixed ration through a TMR might look like and some other potential feed ingredients that you might see. So some take-home messages as we wrap up Unit 4 mini lecture series here is we need to be able to identify differences in nutrient and nutrient needs and what they're for. We need to be able to differentiate between what a monogastric and ruminant digestive tracts, what they do and how they function and how we would feed them differently. You next need to be able to evaluate proper farm livestock feeds and feeding programs. And this one we will only scratch on here in this unit. We'll do a lot more of that if you take our animal nutrition class. And then finally, we have to be able to critique our environmental impact and be able to be proper environmental stewards. So I hope you enjoyed this mini lecture series on animal nutrition. Again, there are entire classes and courses of study in this, so we're just introducing you to some basics here. Thanks for tuning in. I'll look forward to our discussions in class.